For 10 years, we've all put one man on the couch, Donald. But it's been about more than just the one patient. It's the system that's around that patient that's been quietly coming apart. We're putting that whole system on the couch. Lots of people think that Donald is destroying the United States government, and they have a fair point there. But what he's been doing is something that Donald has been, one thing he's good at, that he's been good at for years, and that's exploiting systemic weakness. He did it with the banks, and he did it with the tax code, still doing it with the tax code, and most importantly, he did it with the law itself. And now he's doing it with the government. The system has been becoming more and more fragile for almost 100 years. And we can't just blame Donald for this because he didn't create these weaknesses. So when we think about how this all started breaking down, it's because we have grown into a much more complex country. We have 390 million people. We have 50 states now. We've added more and more departments to the government to manage some of this change. We have this technology, and Congress still hasn't even started to deal with how to manage and legislate around safety in this technology, even 20-year-old technology. So the system that was meant to govern us and govern our country has not kept pace with that evolution. And there are times that it couldn't, and there are times that it wouldn't, that it was deliberate. And now we can see it failing across multiple dimensions. So today we're not going to be focusing on the people who exploit the system for their own ends. We're going to focus on the structure itself. And then we're going to close with the 7 of discs because Crowley's name for this word really seems to be the only word that can describe this. You're watching The World on the Couch, where we put a psychological lens on the daily news cycle because that's the part that the news almost always misses. I'm Dr. Marlene Ryle. I'm a psychologist and a psychiatric nurse practitioner with 30 years of experience in the field. So, governmental structures can operate a lot like silos. So, when we think about people being in silos, we think immediately that they're all separated and the coordination just isn't there. And people aren't talking to each other. They settle into their own turf. And, we just call that bureaucracy. But it's something more structural than that. It's a part that's been walled off from a bigger thing, right? One agency, one specialty, one department. The whole has gotten too complex for any single part to hold it, so we divide it up, and that's a natural and normal thing to do. But it costs something, and the problem is when you silo things off, then you're creating parts that are very simple, but then they're not really reflecting the complexity of the whole and the reality of that complexity. So when you have regulators who are coming from a simplified system, it's going to build in blind spots to that system, and they're guaranteed into the structure because they're built on seeing things from one point of view in one more simplified way. And it's not just like bad luck that this would happen. It's built in. And a part that doesn't have an independent voice checking it doesn't have a corrective apparatus, right? It's exactly what the absent observing function does to a psyche, that part of the self that registers consequences, says no, says, that isn't right and you shouldn't do it. And an institution without a regulatory system that can actually reflect it well is the same as a psyche without that observing ego. It's the same failure in 2 different scales. Now, silos don't ever sit in a stable world. The environment that we live in is accelerating, which is why the answer to strengthening these structures is not about building a better fixed structure. It has to be one that can keep becoming more complex, that can adapt, not a better fixed point. So what silos do is they destroy some important functions. And the main function is that integration. It's what holds these differentiated parts in contact, the kind of structure that can actually correct the others. When it works, the parties can stay distinct and yet accountable to one another. When it fails along 3 dimensions or 3 axes. So the first one is the horizontal dimension across disciplines. And I've seen this firsthand. Silos that can't speak to each other end up operating kind of within each other's boundaries, but outside the boundaries. I work in co-occurring disorders, mental health and substance use disorders, along with physical health disorders. And they were all separated in the Department of Health where I worked. So getting everybody in the same room to speak the same language was very difficult. And you could see this in treatment programs. I worked on projects that tried to screen people for substance use in mental health treatment places and screen people for mental health disorders where they were receiving substance use treatment. So it was very difficult to get everybody moving together. And because of those separations, people get lost in that gap. And if you're in the gap, you're nowhere. The second axis is temporal. It's the one about institutional memory. The system's observing function is very tied to memory. It watches across time. It remembers what was tried and what it cost. When I worked for the Department of Health, we used to joke about the graveyard of dead projects. The things that either were tried and failed, the things that never got off the ground. But if you remove the people that do that reflecting, that know where the graveyard of dead project is, you can't actually do the work. You don't know what you've tried before. When you put that against like a re-election and you change things like, with new rules to Schedule F, and you allow government workers who have that institutional memory to be relieved of their positions for political reasons, the system can't learn. The system can't develop. It's only going to keep repeating things. The third axis is a dimensional axis across people who actually are people. I think about the 2-party system, Democrats and Republicans. It's like a forced choice instrument. You either are A or you're B. There's no room for anything else. It's a binary. It collapses a continuous, multi-dimensional space into a binary because a binary is easy to score. And everything that doesn't fit into it just gets kind of squashed out of the whole idea. And worse than that, the lock-ins kind of become self-reinforcing. The pathway that would let it adapt has been paved over. So when we think about that, we could think about the fact that, yes, we have an independent quote unquote party, but they don't actually have a party apparatus. And the idea of creating a party apparatus that could compete with the 2-party system the lift is too heavy. If it weren't so heavy, it would have been done already. So you can see that these axes are starting to fail among multiple dimensions. So I want to show you one place where the adaptation in government just stopped deliberately. For the first 140 years, the House of Representatives grew after almost every census. More people, more representatives. It's a good system. That was the design, and it was a structure that was supposed to expand in concert as the country expanded so that people got the proper representation. And then in 1929, it stopped. Congress passed a law that froze the number of representative seats at 435, and it has stayed there ever since. The only time in its history that the House failed to reapportion the way it was meant to reapportion. Now, the freeze that occurred at that time didn't actually stop the problem or solve that representation problem. It was actually to solve a fight that was happening in Congress at that time. And who remembers what that fight was? Well, the fight was actually about the shift that was happening and is still apparent in our country today, is the shift between rural and urban areas. And reapportioning meant that some states would lose power, especially the more rural states. And that was intolerable to the people in those states, or to the people who represented the people in those states. So rather than find the right number and find a fair way to apportion, the Congress at that time just kept the number it had, right? It stopped adapting at the moment that adapting had a cost, and that it became painful. That's not a coincidence of history. It's what we call in clinical terms a defense. We call it splitting. Keeping things fixed because metabolizing change is more than the system can bear, because structure freezes instead of feeling it. 100-year-old legislative fossil. And that freeze cost the country because the country kept growing and the number didn't. In 1789, the average average congressman spoke for about 30,000 people. That was the constitutional ceiling. In 2020, each congressman now speaks for about 760,000 people. The thing being represented grew roughly 25 times over. The thing doing the representing stayed exactly the same size. Now, the Senate was never meant to scale that way, and that was by design. 2 per state. But we can see that design never anticipated the magnitude of the population that would occur in this country, that we had only seen a quarter of the mass of the country at that point. And once we expanded westward and then industrialization, the population exploded. So as of the 2020 census, California had about 39 or 40 million people. Wyoming had less than 1 million. But the same 2 votes for each state still held. So when you work it out, somebody living in Wyoming carries something like 68 times the weight that a senator carries in California. I'm not going to tell you what I think the right number is. That's a reform conversation, and that's not what we do on the couch. But I'm telling you something much simpler, and I think something much more difficult at the same time. The structures stopped growing at the precise moment when growing became a conflict. The adaptation didn't just peter out gradually over time. It was deliberately halted, and then it was frozen in place. And a structure that can't adapt when the adapting gets hard isn't stable. It's an arrested structure. Now we're gonna pull the tarot card, and the one I selected for this particular episode is from the Crowley Thoth deck again. And his interpretation of this card is different from many of the others in other decks. I chose the 7 of discs. Discs are also called coins in other decks, but the word on the bottom is failure. Now, when we think about this kind of failure, it's very different from some of the more dramatic cards. This is not failure from a lightning bolt or something happening from outside. This isn't catastrophe in that sense. But what you're looking at is dead vegetation, fruit and vegetation that died on the vine. You're looking at spoilage and blight, things going to rot on the vine. Now, nothing attacked this field. No storm came through. It rotted because the work stopped. Crowley's word underneath failure is also sloth, because the work was abandoned. Someone stopped tending to the ground, and this is what happens when you don't do it. Now, I realize there's a bit of a double entendre here, because this is not just the frozen house. It's the silo that no one will reach across. It's every place we've stopped doing the slow work of keeping the parts in contact, and call the rot that followed just the way things are. Things are also rotting on the vine because of the deportation policy, because of the anti-immigration policies of this administration. Our own food supply is rotting on the vine. Like I said, the discs in this card are laden, and Crowley suggests that they're bad money. A harvest that was supposed to feed something, but it turned to lead. Next time, we're going to talk about whether anything can grow back. You've been watching The World on the Couch. I'm Dr. Marlene Ryle. Thanks for watching. The couch is always open.